And so do stop by and grab one of those, and that way you can order it online. So we have a taped, right? For our next presentation, we actually do, let me pull here to my section. So Andrea Richards is a Caribbean archaeologist. She's presently targeting natural and cultural heritage as it's being impacted by natural hazards and climate change. Her focus is on mitigation and adaptation planning through culture, post-disaster needs, and vulnerability assessments. She has a particular interest in the sustainable use of heritage and is currently undertaking doctoral research on climate change adaptation and heritage. She really is focusing this presentation centering the voice of local communities. We've been hearing about community engagement. Her priority is really to the inclusion of cultural heritage in broader climate change discussions and planning, because that is extremely limited right now. So it becomes an issue of awareness, understanding, and utilization of traditional, local, and indigenous knowledge, particularly in how we prepare, mitigate, and adapt. So she'll be discussing that in her presentation, and then we may have her online afterwards for questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Andrea Richards, and I would like to thank the National Trust for inviting me to speak today and to present on the topic locals in heritage and local communities in climate change adaptation in the Caribbean. We're living in a time of unprecedented climate change or climate-induced hazards, particularly here in the Caribbean. And so I'm happy to speak on the intersections between climate change, heritage, and local communities as we think about stories of resilience in the Caribbean, and when we think about our future sustainability as islanders. So I want to first just do an overview of my presentation. So I want to talk about our current context, and then I hope to go into how it all began, which is how I started in this area and its relevance to this presentation today. And then I hope to look at the place for heritage in mitigating, adapting, and building resilience with community-specific examples from the region. Then we look at future opportunities or synergies and key takeaways from this presentation today. So our current context is our region is being significantly impacted by the changing climate, our heritage, our coastal communities, and very importantly, we also have to think about the number of coastal historic towns that we have in the region. These are all going to be on the front line of the impacts that we have to face in years to come. There's presently no place for heritage at the climate change adaptation table. There's very limited recognition of the contribution of heritage to this discourse. And communities are often at the receiving end of climate change actions, yet not a part of consultations in the design of projects or programs that will impact them. And so there are very limited opportunities to integrate this cultural data in national planning and in building a sustainable future. I want to anchor my presentation today in this Article 7.5 of the Paris Agreement, which is that parties acknowledge that adaptation action should be based on and guided by the best available science and as appropriate traditional knowledge, knowledge of indigenous peoples, and local knowledge systems. Now, in how it all started, I worked on a project in the Dutch-speaking islands and Suriname. And so in those countries, there was a component of the project that focused on how communities use their intangible heritage to respond to natural hazards. So they looked at how they use their intangible heritage for each phase of the disaster management cycle. So how we prepared, how we responded, how we recovered. So I wanted to share some examples from that. And the first example I wanted to share is from Curacao, where communities documented how their use of traditional practices were being used to respond to natural hazards. And the example they gave was of the Kadushi plant, which was very important in times after a hurricane had passed, or their water system was in some way contaminated by sedimentation, that they could use a piece of the kadushi, they would cut it and put it in the water to clean it, and it would make it accessible for drinking and personal use. The other example I wanted to share from St. Eustatius was where they documented how natural hazards were impacting them in the way that they were losing materials and resources. There was a displacement of their practitioners and knowledge bearers, and disruption of the practices and the context within which they were practiced. So here they gave an example of the Miss Blyden drink, which is a drink that they traditionally use at Christmas time. And so because the hurricanes came, it brought in pests, which totally wiped out the plant on the island. And so they were not able to enjoy their traditional drink anymore. And then when we go to St. Martin, they spoke about how their traditional healers were losing the plants that they use for their practices as a result of the threat that existed because of hurricanes. And then in the case of Suriname, the indigenous communities there spoke about how the heavy rains and the rising groundwater levels were impacting their agricultural plots, and also how it was causing issues with the cassava roots that they so heavily utilized for making cassava products there. So this causes us to highlight food security issues in some of our communities. And when we think of in the region, particularly where we have a very high food import bill, we think of how natural hazards can impact our food security in the region, impacting our agricultural produce. And so climate change is really going to be impacting so many areas of our lives in the region when you think about that, and in the future that we're looking towards. I wanted to first start by looking at how, because we need to look at climate change as through the lens of long-term perspective. So we need to see how communities responded in the past. And sometimes persons may not think that the Caribbean region that climate change is really a new thing to the region. But this is something where the region has experienced severe climate variability for thousands of years. It has gone through extreme sea level rise and also severe coastal erosion. So this is really not a new thing for us in the region. So we first throw our eyes back and look at how communities responded in the past. And so here I want to highlight from the Ons Alagourde site in Guadeloupe, where in the first image, the community basically moved their settlement back, or they relocated it, and then moved it back to the coastline based on changes in the coastline. And these are things we need to look at, because obviously, as I said before, the changes are not new to us. In the next image, it shows how communities anchored their houses during to really manage the severe wind action. And so they would anchor these post holes very deeply in the ground, and this was identified as an adaptation strategy for these earlier communities. In the case of another example to share is the case from Morel in Guadeloupe, where the coastline has gone through approximately 60 meters of loss. And so this map shows the coastline changes over 1948 to 1993 to 2020. And these are also issues that we will have to deal with in the present time. So it's very important to understand these changes through archaeological research, how they happened in the past. and in some instances, what they can teach us for future planning, future adaptation. Another example coming from Morel is the use of the pot stack technology to obtain fresh water. And this is something that was also utilized in other countries, for example, Barbados, where it was important to note that the populations then were putting in place technology that would ensure that they would get access to fresh water. In the case of this site, the picture also indicates the rising sea level as the lower vessel is now in salt water, and it also indicates coastal erosion because the well technology was originally situated at the foot of the dunes. So this is really, through the archaeological research here, it has shown us how the changes that have taken place on the coastline in the past, and again, very relevant for us as we plan for the future. The next image shows the site of Brighton Beach in St. Vincent. And this is a site that is also impacted by sand mining. So we know that that will exacerbate coastal erosion. But in this case, the community was very instrumental in the rescue archaeology that took place to safeguard the site. And this is also a very good way to involve local communities because they are able to experience how they're losing their heritage. They're able to visualize climate impacts directly. And this is one way to ensure that actions are sustainable, moving forward. So the community was involved in this, and they became a central part of building the awareness surrounding the site and what was happening to the site as a result of coastal erosion. Another example to where the community was very much involved is the case of St. Kitts, where, and this was largely through collaborative action with many different partners, but they were able to record not only the archaeological heritage that was being impacted in the coastline, but it was also able to look at the livelihoods that were being impacted and capture the perceptions of communities in relation to how they saw climate change, how they saw it impacting them, how they saw it impacting their heritage around them. An important outcome from this was the creation of a baseline management system where that could really help policymakers in the decisions that had to be made for the sites and other sites in the country. And so these partnerships are very critical and should be examples that we can replicate throughout the region as we move forward and look at how we envision using heritage, using the knowledge from local communities to really build resilient systems in place and put these in place. This part goes a bit into my research, and this focus on indigenous communities in the Caribbean. And this is an interesting case study for me because this is Sandy Bay, a new Sandy Bay in St. Vincent, and there's an old Sandy Bay that the Kalinago community lived in. But again, due to severe environmental hazards, the site was relocated, and it stands today in this coastline as New Sandy Bay. One of the very interesting things that came from this, and we know that St. Vincent was in the news because of the eruption of La Soufrière, but the perceptions that the communities had in relation to how they saw a cycle in relation to the volcanic eruption and the coastal erosion that was taking place, because they spoke often about the eruption contributing to the buildup of their coastline, and then the hurricane and the severe wave action would also be eroding the coastline. And so they were able to speak about those issues and also to talk about how that was impacting their heritage and their lives in these coastal areas. And in one key important step that they took was to start to document on their own what they had lost. And so this map shows how the community in New Sandy Bay, or just Sandy Bay, they were starting to document what they had lost and what they thought that they might lose in years to come. And given the opportunities, communities are very much interested in participating and developing their own strategies, their own projects that are very relevant. Sometimes we tend to go in and present a project. But very often, if we should really talk with communities about the projects that they want to develop around what they see as how they're being impacted by climate change, we could really have some very interesting projects being developed. Then I wanted to talk about another component of the work in the region, which was doing some coastal vulnerability assessments in relation to the archaeological record. So in this case, 4 countries were looked at: Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, and Jamaica. And in partnership with other local stakeholders and community members, we were mapping sites. And of course, this is done sometimes within the context of very limited site inventories existing in countries. But community members would be willing to also participate in identifying sites. And so we're able to map sites which are in a danger of being eroded away. And from that, we're developing some tools that will benefit communities and also any other stakeholder in the country that needs it. And this is also feeding directly into a project that I will speak on a little bit later when I'm talking about citizen science initiatives. So this was done for several countries. In Barbados, this map was created before we had finished mapping all the sites, but we had done an entire coastline mapping in Barbados. This was also done in Antigua and Barbuda, a partial coastline mapping in St. Lucia and in Jamaica. The importance of these assessments to local communities and why it's important for them to be involved is that these assessments on our coastlines are very good indicators of the health of our coastlines. And so they're able to guide processes having to do with planning and policy development and other strategies that need to be developed. And so this is one avenue or one pathway that is very important to seeing how cultural heritage data can become relevant to our national planning process and how it directly involves the communities that are in and around this space. This image comes from, or was created partially from, work with the Charlestown Maroon community in Portland, Jamaica. And Portland is one of the most disaster-prone parishes in Jamaica. And the Charlestown Maroon community lives right next to a river that often causes problems, especially when there's heavy rains in the country. And so the community was identifying the strategies that it had put in place to manage different hazards. So when it was looking at the damage reduction, it identified that it was building its houses on stilts or on higher foundation to adapt to flooding. In relation to flood prevention, they dug ditches around the houses to mitigate against historical flooding. And for erosion control, they depended on the planting of wild cane along the banks of the Buff Bay River to manage river flooding. And so this is but one of the initiatives that the communities are developing on their own. There are, of course, other initiatives being developed that we can't really elaborate on today or during this presentation. In Dominica, an important component here was that they spoke about vernacular architecture and their ability to withstand strong winds, from hurricanes. And so we were looking at the houses in Dominica, and this is within the Kalinago territory. And so we looked at these houses and we documented elements having to do with construction techniques that were relevant to how we continue to build houses in the future. So having to look at the angles of the roof, and how houses were anchored. These sought to bring the community more on board because they were willing to participate in these discussions, because this was a very important opportunity for knowledge exchange in these communities, because they had so much to share about these houses. So, we had a very good discussion on, yes, we're not talking about the fact that we're suggesting that anybody lives in a wooden house. Not that there's anything wrong with a wooden house, but just, well, what are the strategies and the techniques that are coming from these vernacular structures that are useful? And the same cases were identified in Roseau, in Dominica, where they were looking at the vernacular architecture and realized that they were capable of, or they were able to better manage stronger hurricanes than modern structures. And so this is an important thing to look at when we're thinking about strategies for the future. As part of that was that we also had community-focused sessions. And in these sessions, were held in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Jamaica, and Dominica. And these sessions provided an opportunity for community members basically to validate information that was shared between them, and also for them to speak openly about their perceptions about climate change, if they saw it really as something that was impacting them, and for them to identify the areas that they saw where they were being impacted. So it was an open, frank discussion with community members, and as I said, it's all about knowledge exchange. It's not a one-sided process. So something again to look at when we're engaging with local communities and their heritage, that it's not something that you go in and tell somebody how to do something. It's learning from them how they have done things and the opportunities to do things better as you continue to share and discuss together. Now, in looking at the citizen science initiatives in the region, the Caribbean region, has had some good examples. And here I want to share the DUNAS project from Puerto Rico, which is Descendants United for Nature Adaptation and Sustainability. And this was a very, I would say this is one of the earlier projects in the region that looked at really involving communities. And so it really focused on restoring the coastal ecosystem, so the dunes. And this was also protecting the ecosystem. It was protecting the habitats and also the archaeological heritage of the site. And this is something that had a very strong community volunteering component. There were programs for children as well, and it is sustained largely because of the volunteerism that takes place from the local communities. Another project I wanted to share is the Barbuda Research Complex project, which, and in this component of it that I've chosen to focus on, I look at the historic wells of Barbuda. And Barbuda is also a country that has water challenges. And so in addition to Antigua, Antigua would use the water catchment areas and the dams, the natural collection areas. And in Barbuda, they focused on these historic wells. And so under this project, a water monitoring program was developed that focused on the historic wells where they were mapped. And the part where I want to highlight is that the young persons were able to connect and learn from their elders. So they were able to share knowledge around the construction of these wells, how they were used, and how they were used in times of, for example, drought, or to deal with any other hazard that might have come up. And so this is an example of where the focus shifted from the researcher to the community, and they took a very active role in the collection of data in relation to the historic wealth of Barbuda. In looking at citizen science initiatives and opportunities for synergies in the region, I want to say that, heritage and local communities are very important to develop climate heritage social action. It's one way to get persons excited about climate change by using heritage. The middle image there is one where this is something I found online, where they were using climate cultural heritage for climate social action, where they were positioned along the coastline, and you can use archaeological sites, known historic sites, to focus these and to get persons to participate in mapping coastline changes, and for opportunities for them to get excited about seeing how what their picture was contributing to telling a story about a place. So a very good opportunity for social action. When we're doing the work, we should focus on, I call it a whole of society approach, but it's to ensure that we tie in livelihoods to whatever we're doing with heritage and the ecosystem base. We cannot look at protecting heritage and not thinking about the whole overall ecosystem. We need to think about the work we do with civil society in monitoring and mapping of sites. And I will highlight something in the coming slides, but there are many opportunities there to work with civil society involved, to get them involved in these activities. Very importantly, we can use sites to tell climate stories, even better when they're in communities. We are able to communicate very powerful messages to wider society when they are able to connect with a particular site. We can develop partnerships, and in some of these cases, for me, it was with the coastal zone management, who never had any interest in the heritage of an area, but are now beginning to see some benefits of integrating this type of knowledge. So I'm thinking, when you look at all of these, you put together a map, you're telling a story about a place, the climate story about a place. You're showing how different components are impacted. These are innovative ways to really reach out to communities and to the wider public to really get them on board in how we're articulating or the stories we want to tell, and how we want to look at climate change, how in relation to for example, how heritage is impacted. And so I'm going to share two case studies that we're trying to develop at the moment. The one is in relation to, again, these sites in Barbados, where we're connecting the sites with fishing villages in Barbados. And we're looking to tell stories there, looking at the livelihoods, how this is being impacted. It's an opportunity to bring in the blue economy as well, collecting oral history in relation to fishing traditions, and linking it all to the heritage in the area, within that community space. And as I said, this is something that we're working on developing right now in Barbados. Another project that we're hoping to get off the ground is in Jamaica, and this is in partnership with the Archaeological Society of Jamaica, where we're working on previously surveyed sites that were done from the 60s and 70s, with a focus on those that are being impacted by climate-induced hazards. And what we're doing is we're going to be trying to reach out to the local communities in a different way, to get their perspectives on things and how they see things going. We're going to have some town hall sessions to really discuss the things. As I said, we need to think outside the box with reaching local communities in the work that's being done, and help them to become a part of the process, not at the middle or the end, but from the very beginning when we're developing these projects. And we're hoping to have like very important media engagement in relation to this. As I said, a new way of looking at climate social action through our heritage and through our local communities. So those are two projects that we're currently working on in Jamaica and Barbados. I wanted to highlight this citizen science initiative because I think it's something that is also useful for us in the region. May even, I gather, taking place as part of your Resilient project in Trinidad and Tobago. But Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk project, mix of, so they had a mix of funding, but they aim to develop partnerships between communities and heritage professionals to manage where possible and safeguard the coastal heritage of Scotland. So they aim to improve baseline data, which we know is very lacking in the region, to improve future monitoring. They would focus on practical projects and look at threatened sites and developing a good group of volunteers. So this was a case where they were making the communities more actively involved in the work that was being done. And so again, opportunities for us in the region. The projects such as this one in Trinidad, I think they're very important because one, we don't tend to focus on these projects in the region. The place is now to do it. And also the fact that these projects can be very good sources to help us to gather relevant data to feed into, as I mentioned before, national discussions in relation to climate change adaptation. So, we really need to go all at it or put everything at it to really get some data moving forward. Some very important takeaways that I'd like to leave as I wrap up my presentation is that one, we need to reposition heritage through communities for future island resilience. We need to innovatively involve communities in climate change, archaeology, and climate social action. Involve local communities at the design stage and not, as I said, in the middle or at the end. And they can co-create strategies with us. They know how they have been living in community spaces for many years. And their local knowledge is very important in what we have to do and how we can learn and move forward. We also need to develop actions and pathways for the integration of culturally derived data in national planning in relation to climate change adaptation. And we need to look for the opportunities within non-traditional partners or stakeholders in the work that we do. We cannot only look at heritage societies or trusts. We really have to broaden our scope. Not just talking about funding, but we live in islands. In our island systems, heritage is not separate from the landscape. So we can't seek to look at one part of it and totally forget the ecosystem that's around us. So it's very important how we really put things together and look at sustainable, holistic strategies moving forward. And I think that if we approach it in this way, bringing together this ecosystem-based approach, we can really have some impacts in the communities that we're working in, and how, as I said, we envision the sustainability of our islands in relation to the changing climate and for years to come. And so I'd like to say thank you again for the opportunity to speak today, and I welcome your questions.
I think we have Andrea with us. Is that right? Seeing her come up here. While they're pulling her up, I just want to make an announcement that anyone who is going to be going on the walking tour, go ahead and meet at the registration desk when we're finished here, and that's your muster point for the tour. So, Andrea, let's see if we have some questions. So, yes, can we get a microphone over to that gentleman? Thank you.
Good evening. Greeting, Andrea from Jalaluddin Khan from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm just concerned that you're linking policy to action strategies linked to our archaeological conservation, climate change, and more so community participatory planning. Could you comment in terms of a regional down to local strategy for implementation where I know under the CARICOM cultural policy, we have archaeological and community conservation, and recently with the OAS project out of Barbados with archaeological and cultural heritage, but ICOMOS was part of that. We are talking possibly of a CARICOM strategy, or somewhere we could really drill down to national planning policy where we could plug in archaeological conservation and participatory community planning in our integrated planning. So I don't know, any thoughts about that, how we either could work country by country or have a united front by region, at least in English-speaking region. I know in the Dutch region they have some strategies, but any thoughts about that as you have done a regional scoping analysis of what's happening policy-wise and implementation-wise, rather than country-specific projects that maybe have been driven by external or by responsive action? Thank you.
All right, I think, and are you hearing me clearly? All right, I think it's good to approach it at different levels. I was not, let's start with the regional cultural policy first. We know that's extremely limited right now, and our various policies across the region are in a different state of flux. My proposal is that we could do something through the Caribbean climate change, the 5 Cs in Belize, where we look at much more like a multidisciplinary approach to how we deal with climate change in the region, where they're going to be pulling in different data sets into developing strategies for the region, which could actually work at the national level. And because of very much how we function in the region, I think that is where the most change will happen. So I was looking at the fact that, our countries need to report, prepare their reports in relation to actions that they're taking in relation to climate change, so that they could possibly look at how they're integrating heritage. First, we can start with a cultural policy at the national level, but also look at our national development plans that I think Mr. Kumar Singh had said earlier today. So we first look at how we integrate. First step, though, is we need to develop the data that can be used. And then we look at how we can integrate it at the different strategy levels across in each country. And then I think, yes, we could look at a regional way to deal with it. But I think a regional approach is not necessarily going to create the depth that we want in the national planning, unless it's like a project base that develops something first. So I would say we need to work at the national level first to see how we can integrate, because we know it won't be the same information across countries. So, a national approach is the best way to first integrate a locally based data into strategies and solutions.
Other questions? Oh, yes.
Thank you, Ms. Richards, for your presentation. It was very interesting. I was struck by your reference to opportunities for synergies, because in my mind I translated synergies to roles. And when you mentioned identifying opportunities for non-traditional partners, I'm like, aha, that one of the keys to addressing climate change and its impacts successfully is to pull together a broad coalition of groups from communities to NGOs to government entities, all who bring different interests and skills, and they might not necessarily align, but they all kind of march in the same direction. So my question is, are there certain partnerships? Are there certain partners that you have identified as being particularly good arrangements for addressing certain aspects? And conversely, do you have examples of partnerships for addressing an aspect of climate change impacts that doesn't work really well because it was a mismatch of interests or abilities?
Well, I haven't identified any that didn't work so well yet, but I'm sure they're there. But some that worked well, one in particular that I could mention is when we were looking at data in relation to traditional housing construction techniques. We spoke to architects and engineering associations at the country level, and I found that was a very unique little partnership that could be formed there. Because in some countries, we need to talk about updating building codes, for example. But how many persons would think about, okay, what is there to learn from how our traditional communities built houses in the past, how they dealt with wind, for example, heavy winds, how they dealt with heat, and other issues like that. So that was an interesting partnership that formed for me. But I certainly think that there are many partnerships that can be developed that are beyond the heritage-related organizations. As I mentioned, coastal zone management was one of them because they tend to develop coastal zone management plans that in no way include heritage. I had mentioned earlier in the presentation that a lot of the historic towns, all our capital cities are in coastal areas, with the exception of Belize, I think. But we're not doing anything, and these are historic towns mostly. So there are opportunities for partnership with whomever you want to based on whatever you want to work with. Because heritage is so central, I think, it certainly can be included in a lot of the discussions that are taking place. But persons are just not really thinking about those partnerships right now.
Thank you, Ms. Richards, and thank you for joining us, all of you, today. I do want to stress that if you heard it once, you heard it more than once, and that is this is a whole community approach, but it is also a whole earth approach, and I think that's what we heard is the message today. So with that, I will let you know tomorrow we'll be here again at 8:30 in the morning. And we'll be hearing more about cultural heritage, more about the built environment, and then importantly, some of the findings from the vulnerability assessments that our team has conducted here in Trinidad. So with that, enjoy the rest of your afternoon, 4 o'clock, well, a little past that. They'll be out there at the desk, and we will see you tomorrow morning. Thank you all very much, and thank you for those joining us online.